The time my son showed up at my door on that Tuesday morning, expecting me to hand over the keys to my truck and sign over my RRSP, he found something he hadn't counted on. The driveway was empty. The side door was dead-bolted from inside, and there was a manila envelope tucked under the mat with his name on it in my handwriting. I heard later from my neighbor Ernie that he stood there for a good 10 minutes before he started shouting. Ernie said he could hear it from inside his garage with the radio on. I want to tell you how I got to that morning. Because it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen because I stopped loving my son. It happened because I finally started loving myself enough to stop. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years working as a millwright at a paper mill outside of Thunder Bay. My wife, God rest her, passed 8 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and those 8 years have been the longest of my life in every way. A person can mean that. After she died, it was just me in the house we'd bought together in 1989 for $114,000, which by the time all this happened was worth somewhere around $580,000. I know that number mattered to my son. I know he'd been doing the math for years. My son is 38. He's my only child. His mother and I tried for more, and it didn't happen. So we poured everything into him, maybe too much of everything. He was a good kid until he wasn't, and I can't tell you exactly when the switch flipped. Maybe it was when he married his wife 9 years ago. Maybe it was before that. Maybe I'm the one who handed him the switch and said, "Here, hold on to this." His wife. I'll say this plainly. Never liked me. From the first Christmas she spent at our house, she had a way of looking around the rooms like she was taking inventory. She'd pick up a picture frame and set it down wrong. She'd open a cupboard looking for something and not close it all the way. Small things. But you notice small things when they happen every time without fail. My son works in sales. Medical equipment. The kind hospitals order in bulk. He makes decent money. Or used to. I don't know exactly when the spending started outpacing the income, but I noticed things. He traded his Corolla for a new F-150 he couldn't have needed. He lives in Mississauga, not exactly off-road country. Then his wife started a small business selling custom wreaths and seasonal decor online, and it went nowhere. But she kept pouring money into it like it just needed one more push. A proper camera setup. A storage unit to hold inventory. A website redesigned. Then another one. I didn't say much. That's not how I was raised, and it's not how I raised him. You let people make their choices. Then last March, he called me. He said he needed to talk. He drove up from Mississauga 4.5 hours, which he'd never done without his wife before, so I knew it was serious. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. Same table where he'd done homework as a boy, same table where we'd eaten 10,000 suppers, and he told me they were in trouble. Real trouble. They owed about $34,000 in credit card debt across 4 cards. His wife's business had taken on a small business loan to the BDC that wasn't performing. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished talking, I said I was sorry to hear it. And I asked him what his plan was. He said that's what he needed to talk to me about. He needed $95,000. He said it like that, not asked. Needed. He had it all laid out. The $95,000 would pay off the credit cards, clear the BDC loan, bring the mortgage current, and give them a bit of breathing room while they restructured. He'd already talked to a financial advisor, he said, although he couldn't tell me the advisor's name when I asked. He said this was an investment in the family, not a gift. He said he'd pay me back over time, when things stabilized. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Have you talked to the bank about your options?" He said the bank wasn't going to help them, that they'd already looked into it. I said, "Have you talked to a licensed insolvency trustee? Because sometimes there are options people don't know about." He shifted in his chair. He said they weren't going bankrupt, that this was just a rough patch, and that I was the one person who could actually fix this. I told him I'd think about it. I said I needed some time. He left that evening. He hugged me at the door, which he didn't do often, and I stood in the kitchen afterward and stared at the wall for a long time. His mother's handwriting was still on a recipe card, stuck to the fridge with a magnet from Niagara Falls. Butter tarts. She'd had her own way of doing things. I thought about what he'd asked. I thought about how I'd feel writing that check. And I thought about something that had been nagging at me since he first started talking. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on until I was washing up the mugs. And it hit me. He hadn't once mentioned cutting back. Not a word about selling the truck. Not a word about his wife pausing the business. Not a word about downgrading the house, or the lifestyle that had put them in that position. He'd laid out the whole problem and the whole solution. And in his version of both, nothing about their life had to change. Only my bank account had to change. I'm not a suspicious man by nature, but I spent 31 years on a mill floor where, if you didn't pay attention to what didn't add up, people got hurt. So, I started paying attention. Over the next 2 weeks, I did some quiet looking around. Not investigating exactly, just looking at what was already visible if you cared to see it. I looked at my daughter-in-law's business Instagram, which was public. She had posted photos from a vendor fair in October, which was fine, but also photos from what looked like a weekend at a cottage in Muskoka in January, tagged with a resort I recognized. I looked up the resort. Weekend rates in January started at $380 a night. The photos showed 2 nights' worth of posts. I called an old friend of mine who'd retired from the CRA. Not for anything official, just a conversation. I described the situation in general terms, and he listened, and then he said, quietly, that sometimes when people are in real financial distress, the spending doesn't slow down first. Sometimes it speeds up. Like the last roll of the dice. I called my own financial advisor, a woman I'd been working with for 12 years. I told her I was thinking about giving a family member a large sum and asked her what I should know. She asked me several questions. She asked if I had the gift in liquid assets, or if I'd have to draw from registered accounts. She asked if I had anything in writing. She asked if I'd thought about what this would mean for my retirement income. I hadn't thought about all of it, not properly. The honest truth was that I had the money. I'd been careful my whole life. I had a paid-off house, RRSPs, a defined benefit pension from the mill, and some non-registered savings. If I liquidated carefully, I could give him the $95,000. It would hurt, but I could do it, and I think that's exactly what he was counting on. I called him 2 weeks after his visit. I said I'd been thinking about it, and I had some questions. Could he send me the documentation on the debt, the card statements, the mortgage arrears notice, the BDC loan terms? There was a pause. He said most of that was on his wife's accounts and he'd have to ask her. I said that was fine, take your time. I never received anything. 3 weeks later, his wife called me. I want to be careful about how I describe this call because I don't want to be unfair. But she opened by telling me that the situation was more urgent than my son had let on, that they were at risk of losing the house within 60 days, and that she needed me to understand that this was a crisis. She used that word several times. Crisis. She said that as his father, I was the only one who could prevent this family from falling apart. I asked her about the documents I'd requested from my son. She said they didn't feel comfortable sharing private financial information, and that this was a matter of trust. I said, respectfully, that I wasn't in a position to give someone $95,000 on the basis of trust alone. She said she found it very hurtful that I was treating my own son like a stranger. Then she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said that if I wasn't willing to help, she would have to look at other options, including whether what I was doing constituted a form of elder financial abuse. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, I'll be in touch. I hung up and I sat down in the living room chair, my wife's chair, the one by the window. The one I never sit in because it still feels like hers. And I thought clearly and calmly about what I was going to do. Elder financial abuse. She'd said it to frighten me. I knew that, but I also knew it could be used as a lever. We'd all read the stories. An accusation like that, even without any substance, could pull in social workers, legal advisors, adult protective services. It could become a thing you had to manage instead of a thing you could ignore. She was smart enough to know that. She'd said it on purpose. I called my lawyer the next morning. I'd known him for 20 years, a man I trusted completely. I told him everything, start to finish. He listened without interrupting, which is what good lawyers do, and then he said, "You have done nothing wrong, you owe nothing, and you have every right to make your own financial decisions." He also said, very gently, that given the threat that had been made, it might be wise to document things going forward. I went home and I sat down at my kitchen table and I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to give my son the money. That much had been clear for a while, but I also wasn't going to keep waiting for the next call, the next threat, the next pressure. I was 67 years old. If I was lucky and careful, and the cancer that took my wife didn't come for me too, maybe 20 good years left, maybe 15, and I didn't want to spend them waiting. I called a realtor I knew from my curling club. Her name is one I won't use here, but she's good at her job and she doesn't waste words. I told her I was thinking about selling. She came and walked through the house and told me honestly what she thought it would fetch. We settled on a number. I didn't tell my son. I started looking at properties in a small town about 200 kilometers north. The kind of place where $580,000 would go a long way. I found a house on a creek lot that had a wood shop already set up in the garage, 2 bedrooms, a covered back porch. It looked like the kind of place a person could finally breathe. I put my house on the market on a Wednesday morning. It sold conditionally by Friday evening. I'm still not entirely over the speed of that. I started moving things quietly, not sneaking exactly. It was my house, my stuff, my life, but deliberately. I didn't want a scene. I took what mattered and arranged to have the rest sold through an estate sale company, which felt strange, but also strangely freeing. I gave my neighbor Ernie a set of the old patio chairs and my spare chest freezer. He didn't ask questions. That's the thing about good neighbors. They seem to understand when questions aren't the point. My son called twice during those weeks. Normal calls, checking in. I kept my voice even. I didn't lie to him. I just didn't tell him what was happening. Technically, it was still none of his business. I kept reminding myself of that. The night before closing, I sat in the empty living room with a cup of tea and looked at the room for a long time. 34 years of living in it. The dent in the baseboard where my son had crashed his bicycle into the wall when he was 9. The spot near the window where my wife's chair had sat. A slightly different shade of floor than the rest because the sun had faded everything around it. I didn't cry. I'd done most of that earlier, alone, when it didn't cost anyone anything. I left the next morning with my truck packed. I'd arranged for the key exchange to go through the realtor. I left the manila envelope under the mat before I pulled out of the driveway. Inside, it was a letter I'd written by hand. I told my son that I loved him and that I always would. I told him I wasn't disappearing because of anger. I was leaving because staying had started to cost me things I couldn't afford to lose. My peace, my sense of myself, the feeling of being a person who made his own choices. I told him I wasn't able to give him the $95,000. I told him I hoped he found a way through because I believed he was capable of more than he'd been showing. I told him about the licensed insolvency trustee option, gave him a name and a phone number. I told him that the door to a real relationship, one built on honesty rather than need, would always be open, and that I hoped someday he'd want to walk through it. I told him where I was going, roughly. Not the address, but the general area. I wasn't hiding. I was leaving. I drove north. The highway thinned out past Barry, and the trees got taller, and the radio signal got patchy, and by the time I crossed the turnoff for my new town, the sky was doing that thing. It does in late September in northern Ontario, going pink and gold over the tree line in a way that looks almost made up. I've lived in this country my whole life, and that still stops me. Ernie called me that evening to let me know my son had come by and stood in the driveway for a while. He said my son had read the letter, and that he'd sat in his car for about 20 minutes before driving away. He didn't shout. I was glad about that. I'd been in my new place about 6 weeks when I got a call from a woman whose name I recognized but hadn't heard in years. She'd been a colleague of my wife's, a social worker, someone my wife had spoken of often and warmly. She'd heard through someone at the Mills Retiree Association that I'd moved, and she'd tracked down my new number through someone I'd given it to, and she called to say she hoped I was well. We talked for almost an hour. She asked about the move. I told her the honest version, without all the detail, and she listened in that way some people have where you can tell they're actually hearing you, not just waiting for their turn. She'd had her own version of a hard few years. She'd lost her husband 18 months earlier. She was finding her way through something similar, the strange, disorienting freedom of a life reorganized around no one's needs but your own. Before she hung up, she said something I've thought about since. She said, it takes a certain kind of courage to stop performing the version of yourself that other people find convenient. I wrote that down after I hung up. A few months later, she told me about a mentorship program she'd started through a community foundation, pairing retired tradespeople with youth in skilled trades apprenticeship programs who didn't have much in the way of family support. She asked if I'd be interested in getting involved. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I've been doing it for 8 months now. I drive out to the college in town twice a week. I work with 4 apprentices, 2 of them from up north, 1 of them from a situation I recognize in broad strokes. The kind of childhood where no one showed you how things were supposed to work. I teach them about machinery, and I teach them about paying attention. I don't know if I'm good at it. They seem to come back. My son and I speak occasionally now. He called me in the spring, out of nowhere, and the tone was different. Quieter. He told me they'd gone to a licensed insolvency trustee, that they'd done a consumer proposal, that it wasn't easy, but it was working. His wife got a job, a real one, with a healthcare company. He sounded like himself. The version I recognized from before things got complicated. He asked if he could come visit. I said yes. He came on a Saturday in June. I showed him the woodshop. We walked down to the creek. He picked up a flat rock and skipped it 4 jumps. And I don't know why that made something loosen in my chest, but it did. He looked around at the town, the trees, the back porch with my chair and my mug, and the birds coming and going at the feeder I'd put up. He said, "Dad, this is actually really nice." I said, "I know." I didn't say, "It almost cost me everything I've saved to understand that nice wasn't something I had to earn permission for." I didn't say, "Your mother would have loved this porch." I didn't say all of it, because some of it doesn't need to be said out loud to be true. What I did say was, "You want coffee?" He said yes. We sat on the porch and drank it, and watched the creek and didn't talk much at all. That was enough. That was, honestly, more than enough. I'm 67 years old. I worked hard for a long time, and I built something, and for a while I almost let it be taken from me piece by piece, not because someone was stronger than me, but because I hadn't yet learned that love and obligation aren't the same thing. My wife knew that. I think she'd been trying to tell me for years in her quiet way. It took me a little too long to hear it, but I got there. The creek out back runs fast in spring and slows in summer and goes still and simmer and goes still and silver at the edges when the cold comes back. Every morning I sit with my coffee and watch it, and I think, this is mine. Not what I owe anyone. Not what anyone needs from me. Just mine and quiet and enough. That's not a small thing. Not at 67. Not after everything. That's the whole point. I've been turning this whole thing over in my head for months now. The way you turn a piece of wood in your hands before you cut it, looking for the grain, looking for where it wants to go. What I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened was sudden. Not my son's choices, not my daughter-in-law's threat, not my decision to sell the house and drive north. All of it had been building for years, slowly, the way pressure builds in a system nobody's maintaining. I just wasn't paying attention to the gauges. I think about the man I was for most of my son's childhood. Steady, dependable, always there with the check or the truck or the weekend to help move furniture. I thought that was love. I still think it was, partly. But I also think I confused love with availability. I was always reachable, always solvable, always the person who made the problem go away. And when you do that long enough, you don't raise a son who knows how to solve problems. You raise a son who knows how to call you. That's not his fault entirely. That's mine too, and I own it. What I've come to understand, not from a book or a podcast, just from sitting on a back porch watching a creek for long enough, is that integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when it's easy. It's about doing it when everything in you wants to write the check and be done with it, when the path of least resistance is also the path that costs you your self-respect. The morning I called my lawyer instead of my bank, I didn't feel brave. I felt tired and sad and about 10 years older than I was, but I also felt, for the first time in a long while, like I was being honest with myself. That's the thing about living with integrity. It rarely feels heroic in the moment. It mostly just feels like the only thing you can stand to do. I think about my son sitting in his car in front of my old house for 20 minutes after he read that letter. I don't know what went through his mind, but I know that the conversation we had on my back porch in June, with the creek running and the coffee going cold, was more real than any conversation we'd had in years. That couldn't have happened if I'd written the check. The check would have bought us another few years of a relationship built on what I could provide, rather than who we actually were to each other. I don't think either of us could have afforded that, even if I could have afforded the money. The hardest part of this whole story, the part I don't think I'll ever fully settle, is knowing that I waited too long. I was 67 before I understood that saying no to someone you love is sometimes the most loving thing available. That boundaries aren't walls, that protecting your own life isn't selfishness. It's just sense. Ernie told me once, years ago, that the strongest structure isn't the one that never bends. It's the one that knows exactly how far it can bend before it breaks. I thought he was talking about the dock he was building at the time. He wasn't.